I didn't steal for greed, Your Honor. I stole because he was dying. She was 83 years old and trembling in her wheelchair. The courtroom was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner and the clicking of camera shutters. Margaret Hill, a frail black grandmother in a worn grey coat and hospital slippers, sat with her hands cuffed loosely in front of her. "Hi, my beautiful family. Let's start with a blessing. Dear Lord, I ask you to surround every person watching with peace, healing, and endless love. Amen. You are not just an audience. You are my family, the reason I push through on the hardest days. For those who are new here, welcome to the family. Please subscribe, say hello in the comments, and let's grow closer together. Each story I bring is my sacrifice and devotion. When you walk away early, it feels like my heart is left unheard. Please, stay with me through the journey until the very end. I love you always. Now let us begin. The courtroom was cold that morning. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow over the polished wooden benches and the silent crowd gathered within. Somewhere in the back, a reporter's camera clicked softly, trying to capture what everyone else couldn't quite believe. At the center of it all sat Margaret Hill, 83 years old, trembling in a wheelchair. Her grey wool coat swallowed her small frame. Beneath it, a faded hospital gown peeked through. The metallic cuffs at her wrists seemed absurd, far too heavy for someone so frail, so human. The clerk's voice broke the silence. Case number 34172. The State versus Margaret Hill. A ripple of whispers followed. A woman near the front gasped quietly. Even the bailiff looked uneasy as he stepped closer to her side, as though half expecting the old woman might crumble into dust. Judge Elliot Sanderson adjusted his glasses and looked down at the thin file in front of him. He was a tall man, silver-haired and stern, with a reputation for strict fairness. But this morning, as he read through the paperwork, something in his expression shifted. Confusion, disbelief, maybe even sorrow. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hill," he said, his voice calm but heavy, "you are being charged with felony theft from St. Mary's Medical Center. Specifically, the theft of 3 vials of insulin. Do you understand the charges?" Margaret nodded slowly, her hands trembling in her lap. "Yes, Your Honor," she said softly. Her voice was cracked but steady, the kind of voice shaped by decades of patience, prayer, and quiet endurance. The prosecutor, a young man in a navy blue suit, stood to speak. "Your Honor, the accused entered the hospital pharmacy unauthorized, removed restricted medication from the refrigerator, and attempted to conceal the items in her bag. Security detained her before she left the building." The judge glanced up. "Attempted? She was apprehended within minutes, sir. The stolen items were recovered intact." Judge Sanderson sighed and leaned back in his chair. His eyes fell on Margaret again. "Is that correct, Mrs. Hill? You attempted to take this medicine?" Margaret's fingers tightened around the cuff chain. She didn't look at him. "Yes, sir," she whispered. The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. The judge studied her, the lines etched deep into her face, the dark skin that had weathered decades of hardship. This woman, he thought, was no career criminal. She was someone's mother, someone's grandmother, someone who looked like she should have been baking bread or sitting in a church pew, not standing trial for felony theft. He leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Hill, may I ask why?" Her lips trembled. She swallowed, then finally met his gaze. "Because he was dying," she said. A low murmur passed through the room. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. The judge frowned. Who was dying? My husband, she said, voice breaking. Franklin Hill. He's 85. He's diabetic. The judge flipped through the file. Indeed, there it was. A note from the arresting officer mentioned that Mrs. Hill had repeatedly asked the police to check on her husband during intake. Go on, the judge said quietly. Margaret hesitated. She looked so small in that chair, so fragile, her eyes glistening with tears she didn't want to shed. Franklin and I have been married 61 years, she began softly. We met back when it wasn't easy for people like us. Me being black, him being white. Folks used to cross the street when they saw us together. But we didn't care. We just kept loving each other. A small smile flickered across her face, a memory breaking through the grey of the present. He was strong then, she continued. Worked as a carpenter. Built our first house with his own hands. But diabetes took that strength. Over the years, it's just been me taking care of him. I used to be a nurse's aide, back in the 60s. I know what to do, how to check his blood sugar, how to watch his breathing. But I can't make the medicine. And without it, her voice faltered. She took a shuddering breath. Without it, he won't last. Judge Sanderson's expression softened. You couldn't afford the insulin? She shook her head. They told me it would be $600 for 1 month's supply. His insurance changed. They said the clinic wasn't covered anymore. I called everyone I could. I begged. They said we had to wait 6 weeks for new approval. But he didn't have 6 weeks. Tears spilled freely now, tracing the wrinkles on her face. I tried, Your Honor. I went to church. I asked for help. I even thought about selling my wedding ring. She paused, voice cracking. But who's buying old love these days? A few people in the gallery sniffled quietly. She went on, her words slow but steady, each one landing like a soft drumbeat. That morning, I found him barely breathing. His sugar was low. I gave him the last of the insulin. He smiled at me and said, Don't cry, Maggie. God will make a way. She looked up at the judge, eyes shining. So I tried to make a way. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the prosecutor didn't move. Margaret took another trembling breath. I went to St. Mary's. That's where I used to work. I still had my old badge from back in the day. I kept it as a keepsake. I walked down the hall like I belonged there. I saw the insulin fridge. I took 3 vials. That's all I wanted. Just enough to keep him alive till our next check came in. Her hands shook harder now. But I didn't even make it to the door. The guard stopped me. I told him the truth. I told him why I did it. He just called the police. A single tear rolled down her cheek. I didn't fight them. I just prayed they'd let me call Franklin. I was so scared he'd die before I got home. When she finished, no one spoke. Judge Sanderson removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Mrs. Hill, he said slowly, did you know that taking medicine from a hospital could be considered a felony? I do now, she whispered. He leaned back, exhaling deeply. For a moment, the stern judge was gone, replaced by a weary man struggling to reconcile law and mercy. Finally, he looked at her again. Mrs. Hill, he said quietly, what you did was against the law. But I believe you when you say you didn't do it for greed or selfishness. She looked up, eyes wide with hope and fear. Then why? The prosecutor asked under his breath, almost involuntarily. Margaret turned her gaze toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't steal for greed, Your Honor, she said. I stole because he was dying. The words hung in the air like a prayer, fragile, unanswerable, and true. The judge sat back in silence, the gavel untouched. Outside, the winter wind howled faintly against the courthouse windows, as if the whole world had paused to listen. Margaret's words still lingered in the air, fragile, trembling, soaked in decades of love and loss. And in that silence, her mind drifted back to where it all began in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1962. The air smelled of sawdust and cigarette smoke when Margaret first met Franklin Hill. He was 23, broad-shouldered and shy, sitting in the corner of the small clinic where she worked as a nurse's aide. A splintered board had torn through his hand on the job, and he sat there, eyes cast low, blood dripping onto the clean white floor. She approached quietly, wrapping the wound with steady hands. "You're lucky," she said, not looking up. "A little deeper, and you'd have lost a finger." He smiled, faint but genuine. "Then I guess I owe you one, miss." Margaret Davis. Their eyes met. A black woman and a white man in the deep South, sharing a glance that could have cost them both their safety. Yet, something in that look refused to turn away. Franklin came back the next week, not because his hand hurt, but because, as he admitted later, "It was the only way I could see you again without causing trouble." They started talking in whispers, in the park after dark, at the back of the churchyard on Sundays. The world wasn't kind to people like them. Her mother warned her, "You'll lose everything, girl." His father spat the words "race traitor" the night Franklin told him he was in love. But love has a way of surviving where logic dies. In 1965, under a sky thick with stars and danger, they left Alabama behind. They rode a bus north to Ohio with $50 between them and a promise whispered in the dark. "No matter what happens, we stay together." They lived in a small brick house Franklin built with his own hands. The kitchen smelled like coffee and cornbread. The radio played softly while Margaret hummed gospel tunes as she cooked. He called her Maggie. Always Maggie. Every morning before work, he'd wrap his arms around her waist and murmur, "Can't start the day without my Maggie's tea." She'd roll her eyes, but smile every time. "You'll spoil me, Frank." "Already have," he'd say. They didn't have much, but they had peace. They had love that bent, but never broke. The laughter grew quieter as their hair turned grey. Franklin's hands, once steady as steel, began to tremble. He slept more, walked slower. When the diagnosis came, type 1 diabetes, Margaret took the paper from the doctor's hand and folded it neatly, her heart pounding. "We'll manage," she said simply. And they did. For years, they kept a rhythm that was almost sacred. Every morning, she boiled water for his tea. Every evening, she checked his sugar, cleaned his syringes, and logged every dose in a worn leather notebook. "Don't you miss sleeping through the night?" he teased one morning. Margaret chuckled softly, tightening her robe. "You're my night's work, old man." But managing an illness on love alone wasn't enough. The years chipped away at their savings. His pension dwindled. Then came the letter, policy adjustment. "Your current insulin brand is no longer covered under plan." Margaret called every number she could find. Each voice on the line said the same thing. "The new cost will be $600 per month." Her hands shook as she wrote the number down. 600. For a bottle that used to cost 60. She began cutting corners quietly, half filling her own prescriptions, stretching meals with broth and rice, turning off the heat early to save on bills. But Franklin always knew. One night, as she prayed beside their bed, whispering, "Don't let him suffer, Lord." "Not yet." Franklin reached for her hand. Maggie, he said softly, don't you go breaking yourself trying to fix me. She squeezed his fingers, her eyes glistening. That's not how love works, Frank. You fix me first. Weeks passed. The fridge grew emptier, the medicine cabinet lighter. Then one morning, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills and a crisp white letter stamped in red. Coverage terminated, payment overdue. Her gaze shifted to the counter. 2 pill bottles, one nearly empty. She exhaled shakily, pressing the paper to her chest. How can I choose, she whispered to the quiet house, between groceries and his medicine? The clock ticked once, twice. Then she wiped her eyes, stood, and whispered again, this time to herself. I'll find a way. The days blurred together in a cold, grey rhythm. The hum of the refrigerator, the cough of the old furnace, and Franklin's laboured breathing filling the quiet. Margaret moved through the house like a shadow, her hands always clutching a bottle, a phone, or a prayer card. The refrigerator was almost empty now. A half carton of milk, 2 eggs, and the faint smell of wilted greens. Even the old tin of sugar she kept for Frank's tea sat nearly bare. He was worse. Dizzy most mornings, his words slurring like someone trying to speak through water. When she touched his forehead, it burned. When she listened to his heart, she could hear how hard it was working just to keep him alive. She called everyone she could think of. Insurance, Medicare, social services, Veterans Aid, even the hospital where she once worked. Each voice on the other end was polite, professional, and empty. I'm sorry, ma'am, but it'll take several weeks to process your application. Have you tried the discount program online? We understand your frustration, Mrs. Hill, but there's nothing we can do immediately. She would hang up, whispering to herself. Weeks? He doesn't have weeks. The next morning, she called again anyway, and again the next. On Sunday, she went to church, the same small Baptist church she and Franklin had attended for decades. The pews were cold. Her knees ached when she knelt. She took one of the little white prayer cards from the rack and wrote, slowly, with shaky hands, Lord, give me strength to do what I must. She slipped it into the wooden box near the altar, and when the choir began to sing, she bowed her head and wept quietly, clutching her old handkerchief to her lips. By Tuesday, Franklin could barely sit up. She found him slumped beside his chair that afternoon, his shirt damp with sweat, his skin pale and cold. Franklin, she cried, dropping to her knees. His eyes fluttered. His lips moved, barely forming the words. She ran for the kitchen, fumbling for the last vial of insulin. It was nearly empty. With trembling hands, she drew up what remained and injected it. His breathing steadied slowly, but when he opened his eyes, the look he gave her was heavy with fear. Promise me, Maggie, he rasped. Promise me you won't do anything foolish. She brushed his grey hair back from his forehead, tears streaking down her face. I can't make promises I don't mean, she whispered. He tried to smile, but it came out as a sigh. You always were the stubborn one. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table under the soft yellow light, staring at her old nurse's badge, the one she'd kept tucked away for decades. Her reflection in its plastic cover was faint, wrinkled, unfamiliar. She folded her hands over it. Forgive me, Lord, she whispered. Just this once. The next morning was bitter cold. Frost lined the porch railings, and the sky hung heavy with snow. Margaret put on her old navy coat, the one with the missing button, and pulled a wool hat over her thinning hair. The same hat she'd worn on their first date 60 years ago. The streets were quiet as she walked towards St. Mary's Medical Center, her old workplace. Her shoes tapped against the pavement, steady but hesitant. Every step felt heavier than the last. Inside, the smell of disinfectant and lemon cleaner hit her like a memory. Nurses hurried by in scrubs, clipboards in hand, too busy to notice the small elderly woman walking slowly down the hall. She passed the room where she once gave candy to children after their shots, the corridor where she and Dr. Lewis used to trade jokes over long shifts. It all felt like another lifetime. Then she saw it, through a small glass window near the pharmacy, the insulin fridge. Rows of tiny vials glinting under the fluorescent light. Her hands trembled as she pressed her palm to the door. "Just 3, she murmured. "Enough for 1 month. Enough to keep him breathing." She slipped inside quietly. The nurse on duty was talking to a patient across the room. Margaret moved quickly, opening the fridge and tucking 3 vials into her purse. Her heart thudded so loud she thought the walls might hear. She turned to leave and froze. "Ma'am," a young voice called. A security guard, barely older than her grandson, was standing by the doorway. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Her fingers clenched around her bag. I was just... The faint clink of glass betrayed her. The boy's face changed. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to stop." 2 nurses turned their heads. Someone called for security. The hallway filled with movement, radios crackling. Margaret's voice broke. "He'll die without it," she cried, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please, I wasn't stealing from me. I just needed to keep him alive." But the guard was already reaching for her arm, gentle but firm. Outside, the world had turned white. Snowflakes drifted across the parking lot as blue and red lights reflected off the hospital windows. They led her out slowly, her steps small, her shoulders shaking. She clutched her wool hat to her head, the same hat she wore the night Franklin had kissed her under the old oak tree, when life had still been kind. Now it hid half her face as she whispered, barely audible through the winter wind, "Lord, have mercy." The station smelled of metal, bleach, and fear. Margaret sat hunched in the cold metal chair, her wrists cuffed loosely, her eyes unfocused. Every sound, the tapping of a keyboard, the hum of a vending machine, echoed in her ears. Her heart was racing far too fast for her frail body to handle. When the nurse on duty checked her vitals, her blood pressure was dangerously high. "She's not fit for holding," the nurse warned. "She needs to be monitored." So, under the faint glow of fluorescent lights, they called an ambulance. As the paramedics lifted her onto the stretcher, Margaret's lips moved in silent prayer. The same words she'd whispered over her husband for years. Keep him safe. Keep him breathing. Hours later, in the hospital ER, ironically, the same St. Mary's she'd stolen from, a nurse she vaguely recognized checked her foreline. "Mrs. Hill, you need to rest," the nurse said softly. Margaret turned her face away. "My husband, he's at home. Alone." Her voice cracked on the last word. When the police finally cleared her to make a call, her hands shook as she held the phone. "Franklin," she whispered. There was a pause, the weak hum of oxygen in the background. "You shouldn't have done it, Maggie," he said. His voice was soft, barely more than breath. "I couldn't just watch you fade away," she replied, tears streaking down her cheeks. "I couldn't." The line went quiet. She could hear him sniffle. Then faintly, "I love you, stubborn woman." The officer gently took the phone back. "Time's up, ma'am." The next morning, the courthouse was still half asleep. A pale winter light spilled through the tall windows as two deputies rolled Margaret into the courtroom in a wheelchair. Her wrists were cuffed loosely now, the metal biting against paper-thin skin. The clerk read the case name, State versus Margaret Louise Hill. The courtroom murmured. People turned to look. A tiny old woman wrapped in a grey shawl, her eyes tired but dignified. Judge Elliot Sanderson adjusted his robe, frowning as he flipped through the file. 83 years old, he muttered. Charged with felony theft of medical property. The prosecutor, a young man barely 30, straightened his tie. Your Honor, the defendant unlawfully removed controlled insulin vials from St. Mary's Medical Center. Estimated value, $180. He paused, looking at her like she was a line in a report. Theft of medical property, under Statute 242.06, qualifies as a felony offense. Margaret's lips trembled. I didn't steal to harm anyone, she said softly. I stole to save my husband's life. Her words hung in the air. The judge looked up, his eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in thought. Your husband is ill? She nodded slowly. Diabetes. He's 85. The medicine costs more than we have. We've tried every program, every number they told us to call. Her voice began to break. I begged them, sir. I told them he didn't have 6 weeks to wait. They said there was nothing they could do. The young prosecutor shifted in his seat. His confidence faltered. Judge Sanderson leaned forward slightly. How long have you been married, Mrs. Hill? Margaret's lips curved into a faint, trembling smile. 61 years, Your Honor. They told us it wouldn't last. A black woman and a white man in Alabama. She chuckled through her tears. But we proved them wrong. The courtroom was silent. Even the reporters lowered their pens. She continued, her words barely above a whisper. We worked all our lives, paid our taxes, raised 3 children who all passed before us. All we wanted was a little peace at the end. She looked down at her hands. But I couldn't sit there and watch him die because we couldn't afford to live. The young prosecutor's jaw tightened. He looked down, avoiding her gaze. The file in his hand trembled slightly. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Quiet outrage, pity, disbelief. Judge Sanderson took off his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. For a long moment, no one spoke. The old clock above the bench ticked steadily in the silence. Finally, the judge looked up, his voice low but firm. This, he said, gesturing toward her, is not justice. This is cruelty disguised as order. He turned to the prosecutor. You're telling me that the system, our system, can't tell the difference between theft and survival? The young man swallowed. It's the law, Your Honor. The judge's hand tightened around his gavel. Then maybe the law needs to remember what mercy looks like. The words rippled through the room, heavy and electric. Margaret bowed her head, a tear falling onto her lap. Outside, the winter wind rattled the courthouse windows, soft, steady, and mournful, as if echoing the heartbeat of a woman who had risked everything for love. The courtroom felt suspended in silence, as if time itself waited to see what would happen next. Judge Sanderson's face was unreadable for a long, heavy moment. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the bench, eyes fixed on the trembling woman in the wheelchair before him. Mrs. Hill, he began quietly, the law asks me to see you as a criminal. He paused. The words seemed to hang in the cold air. But my conscience tells me otherwise. He pushed the file aside with a slow, deliberate motion. I will not make a criminal out of a woman who only wanted to save her husband. A murmur spread through the room. relief mixed with disbelief. The young prosecutor blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Your Honor," he stammered. Judge Sanderson's tone hardened. "You want to enforce the law," he said, his voice rising just enough to echo through the chamber. "Then enforce compassion." He raised the gavel, and with one decisive strike that cracked like thunder, declared, "Case dismissed, immediately." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. One woman in the back covered her mouth. Another crossed herself. Margaret bowed her head and began to sob, quiet, trembling sobs that shook her frail shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered between tears. "Thank you, Your Honor, thank you." The judge nodded once, but he wasn't finished. He gestured toward his clerk. "Call St. Mary's Medical Center," he ordered. "Get the social work department on the line. Mr. Franklin Hill's case is to be reopened immediately." The clerk scribbled notes, already reaching for the phone. "And another thing," the judge continued, turning to the prosecutor. "Contact the VA office. Mr. Hill served his country, and this is how he's repaid? Not on my watch. He's entitled to medical assistance, and I want those benefits processed today." The prosecutor hesitated, then nodded, shame flickering across his face. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge looked around the courtroom, his gaze sweeping over everyone. The spectators, the officers, even the reporters clutching their notebooks. "We live in a world that measures worth by paperwork and numbers," he said, his voice steady but full of fire. "But today, this courtroom remembers mercy." He stood, something he almost never did during sentencing, and placed a hand over his heart. Because justice without compassion is nothing more than cruelty dressed in robes. Even the bailiff looked moved. With a nod from the judge, he stepped forward and gently unlocked Margaret's cuffs. The clink of the metal echoed through the room like the end of a long, painful story. Margaret lifted her tear-streaked face. "God bless you, sir," she whispered. Judge Sanderson met her gaze. "No, Mrs. Hill," he said softly. "God bless you. You reminded us what love looks like." Reporters began to murmur, scribbling furiously. One whispered, "This'll make the evening news." But even their voices seemed muted in the reverent quiet that followed. As Margaret was wheeled out of the courtroom, a faint smile trembled on her lips, the first in days. The doors swung shut behind her, but the hush lingered, as if the air itself had absorbed what had just happened. Justice redefined. 3 days later, the winter sun was pale but gentle as it spilled through the thin curtains of the Hill's small apartment. The faint smell of mint tea filled the air. Franklin sat in his armchair, a blanket over his knees, his face still pale but peaceful. When the knock came at the door, Margaret rose slowly and opened it. A nurse stood there, holding a small brown box. She smiled warmly. "Mrs. Hill? I'm from St. Mary's. Judge Sanderson asked that I deliver this personally." She placed the box on the table and opened it. Inside were 3 vials of insulin, neatly packed, glimmering faintly in the morning light. Margaret's breath caught. "No charge?" she asked, voice trembling. The nurse smiled. "No charge," she said. "Courtesy of the court and the VA. You're both covered now." Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, tears filling her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. She turned toward Franklin. He was watching her with that same soft smile she'd fallen in love with 60 years ago. "I told you, Frankie," she said, her voice cracking as she held the vials close to her heart. "We're still blessed." Franklin reached for her hand. "We always have been," he said. The nurse quietly slipped out, leaving them in the soft glow of morning. Outside, the sun broke through the grey winter sky, flooding the room with light, warm, golden, and merciful. It touched the old photographs on the wall. Two young lovers in 1962 Alabama, hand in hand against all odds. And as Margaret drew the curtains open, that same light spilled over her husband's face, his eyes bright once more. Because sometimes, justice isn't found in the law, but in the hearts brave enough to bend it.